I was walking down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
Welcome back to another episode of NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. I'm your host, Matthew Martin.
And I'm Dr. Timothy Christie.
And here at New Brunswickers Want Action, we're about action. So before we jump into today's topics, we just want to remind you folks of our 3 call to actions. First being a public inquiry into systemic racism within New Brunswick, the inclusion of Black history in our educational curriculums, and the criminalization of racial discrimination. So Tim, we have some few important topics to talk about today.
That's right, Matthew, thank you. The issue one of the most important issues that's happened today is that earlier this month, the Coroner's Inquest released their report on the Rodney Levi shooting that happened on June 12th of 2020. And they claim that the shooting was actually a homicide. So just to remind people of what happened with Mr. Levi, was in June of 2020, he and a friend showed up at a barbecue. So Rodney wasn't feeling well. He showed up at a barbecue, and it happened to be a person who was a local pastor. And they were having a barbecue, so the pastor graciously invited Rodney and his friend to stay for something to eat. But it was clear Rodney was not well. So he was exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. He actually had 2 big knives that he had, and he had them in the front pocket of his hoodie. And his behavior was quite erratic. So some people at the barbecue, a couple of them called the police on from different phones. So a police officer arrived and started trying to talk to Rodney or to Mr. Levi and try to get him to give up the knives. And Mr. Levi said to the police officer, could you call an ambulance for me? So at this point, the police officer said that they realized that he should be apprehended under the Mental Health Act. And they called an ambulance. Shortly thereafter, before the ambulance arrived, a second police officer showed up. Things escalated quite rapidly. That second police officer tased Mr. Levi 3 times because he wouldn't give up the knives. And after the 3rd taser, he picked up the knives, is going towards the police, and they shot him and they killed him. Now, there was a group out of Quebec that do investigations into police shootings in New Brunswick. So we don't have our own group in New Brunswick that do this investigation. It's a group out of Quebec. So they're basically an independent watchdog. And what they did was they did an review of the situation where they interviewed witnesses, basically just interviewed some witnesses, and then they wrote up a report. And they submit this to the province, and the province said the likelihood of getting a conviction based on this evidence is so small that we're not going to pursue it. So that meant the officers were exonerated from any criminal liability in this case. However, just recently this year, the coroner did an inquest as well. And the point of a coroner review is 2 things. One is to identify or confirm the identity of the deceased, but the second is to determine the cause of death. So the cause of death could be a natural cause of death, it could be death by accident, it could be death by homicide, it could be death by suicide, or death by other. So one of the hypotheses people were throwing out there was that Mr. Levi was trying to have death by cop or suicide. But the inquiry, the coroner's inquiry, said no, it was a homicide. People were quite happy about this, that it was deemed a homicide. But just calling something a homicide, all it means is that one person killed another. It doesn't give any judgment on it. So it doesn't mean is it justified killing or an unjustified killing. So for instance, a soldier in war commits homicide. Doesn't mean it's good or bad, it just means it's happened. So the next step would be to say, what kind of homicide is it? Is it a culpable homicide or a non-culpable or inculpable homicide? And that hasn't been done. So what we have so far is that the police came, they assessed the situation, they tried their best to de-escalate it, and in their opinion, they thought their lives were at risk, so they shot and killed Mr. Levi.
And to me, this brings up, a very common slogan we hear as police officers, that police officers are here to serve and protect, which makes me wonder, in this situation, who were the police there to protect or to save? Because when you look at the facts, they didn't go in and close down the scene. There were still bystanders in the area. Rodney Levi was not. He was tasered, I believe, 3 times. So they did attempt to subdue him, but not every instance was taken to really protect even the bystanders, which makes me wonder who were they protecting.
Well, that's right, because the police had options. If they really thought he was a threat, they could have evacuated the scene. They could have got everybody away. But when you look at the transcripts of what happened, who did the police save? They saved themselves. They weren't, he wasn't lunging with knives at any of the other witnesses, any of the other people at the barbecue. He was lunging at knives at the police, who are the ones who came to the scene, started tasering him, and he was trying to take care of himself, defend himself somehow, do something other than sit there passively and let them tase him over and over and over again. And this shows a mentality from the police where we have a person that has an obvious mental illness, and their focus is not on how do you interact properly or competently or professionally with a person exhibiting symptoms of a mental illness. What they try to do is have 100% control over that scene. Their mind is, we've got to control this situation. So that's where they start giving him orders. Drop the knives. Things escalate. If you don't drop the knives, we're going to tase you. Drop the knives. Oh, he's coming towards us. You're too close. Back off. All they're doing is giving orders. What in the world do they think a person exhibiting symptoms of mental illness are going to do when that's the way they interact with this person? So ultimately, when they shot him, it wasn't because he was attacking anyone else. It was because he was coming at one of the police officers. Who are the people that were there and responsible for escalating this to that level in the first place? So I love your question, Matthew. Who did they save? They saved themselves in a situation that they created themselves. And it did not have to end up that way.
And I think this brings up a great topic that a lot of people have been discussing around defunding the police. Now, defunding the police takes a look at taking funds from our police system and moving them to other services such as mental health services. And these type of situations show that our mental health services are there to save and to serve individuals exhibiting, mental health illnesses. In an incident with our police forces, they arrived to a scene clearly not prepared for a mental health illness, and resulted in the death of an individual. And this isn't something that just happens within New Brunswick. We see this right across the country of police responding to wellness checks and individuals winding up dead. I think that also brings us to another point that's been discussed, and I want to break it down in 2 points. First, I want to start to say is when we look at mental health calls, it's not something that, like when you see on TV, an individual just doesn't show up and talks that person off the ledge. Here in New Brunswick, the reality of it is when a mental health call is brought in, a phone call is put out over dispatch, and the first officer, whoever's closest, shows up on scene. Now, we do have mobile mental health crisis units here in New Brunswick, but some of those individuals are on call. They're not consistently checking to see if they're needed somewheres. Now they are, specifically stationed to work certain hours, but there is that delay, and the reality of it is when a mental health call comes in, the first person to show up is going to be the closest police officer. Whether they're trained to handle a mental health call or not, they're the first ones to arrive. Which brings me to my second point. We hear a lot of conversations around defund the police, and I think my first point shows the importance of why defund the police is an important aspect to look at. When police are arriving to a scene, they're already responding to a million other issues, but they are not properly trained to be handling individuals going through a mental health crisis. When we look at defund the police, we're looking at taking funds that are already put towards our police officers and moving them so that they can be more effectively used in addictions, mental health, educational services, so that they can better serve their community. Because currently, when a police arrives to a mental health call, they can't service or help that individual adequately, and we see that with the death of Rodney Levi. But if we can have trained mental health professionals at the scene, that situation could have ended vastly different.
Right. So I agree with you. One stat from Stats Canada says that the police have about 1 million interactions a year with people who have either mental illness or problematic substance use disorder. That's 1 million interactions with the police. Out of all of these interactions, most people who are shot and killed by police have a mental health disorder, a mental illness of some sort, or a problematic substance use disorder. So if we know that these are the things driving police shootings, we know that we don't need armed, trained police officers to deal with these situations. So for example, I work in the hospital sector, and we have patients come in sometimes that are armed. We have a lot of patients that have mental illness, psychiatric disorders, problematic substance use disorder. None of us working in healthcare would ever think that the solution here is to shoot and kill one of our patients. That would never cross our mind. But for the police, if they can't get 100% domination of that scene, the environment they're in, they will actually resort to the use of lethal force. And most of us would say, well, that's the wrong response. What happened to Mr. Levi is absolutely, hands down, the wrong outcome. So how could we do better? Well, one idea of defund the police is you take resources from the police and you allocate them to people trained to deal with these types of things. If we look at what happened with Mr. Levi, he wanted to get into the hospital and he couldn't. He went to his pastor's house. He asked them to call an ambulance. Why would he ask for an ambulance? So that the ambulance can take him to the hospital and hopefully get in. If there were other supports in the community that he could go to, perhaps he would still be alive, because he was trying to access services. So even though he was sick, he was erratic, he was armed, he was posing some type of behaviors that disturbed everyone around him. And in his heart of hearts, he was trying to get help. Call an ambulance for me. Why is he saying that? Because there's nowhere else for him to go. So if that's your last resort, to call an ambulance, and in the meantime the police shoot and kill you, it shows that we're approaching these problems in the wrong way. And if we want to talk about how racist our policing system is, the statistics speak for themselves.
Yeah, so even from 2017 to 2021, 51% of individuals who were shot and killed by police were from a racialized community group. From there, if we look at our entire Indigenous population, they make up about 4.9% of our population, but they make up 38% of individuals who are shot and killed by police. Black individuals make up 3.5% of our population and are 9% of those individuals who are shot and killed by police. From that, we can also look at between our Indigenous population and the number of individuals in prison, they're vastly overrepresented by 500%, and our Black community likewise is vastly overrepresented by 250%. So statistically, our system has been designed to put Indigenous and Black individuals into a prison system, and if they can't get them there, they shoot and kill them.
So those are incredible statistics. So let's just slow that down for 1 second and unpack it. So what the statistics tell us is that Indigenous people make up 4.9% of the Canadian population. Mm-hmm. But of all the people shot and killed, they make up 38% of the people shot and killed by police.
That's correct. So it'd be a 700% overrepresentation.
Right. And then with black people, we're 3.5% of the population, and we make up 9 or 10% of the people shot and killed by police.
Yeah.
So this means that an Indigenous person is 7 times more likely to be shot and killed by a police officer. So if they're exhibiting the symptoms of an illness or dealing with a problematic substance use disorder and the police interact with them, they are 7 times more likely to be shot and killed. Blacks are 2 or 3 times more likely to be shot and killed than a white person. This shows the inherent bias of policing, is that when they see an Indigenous person or see a black person, the idea of a threat, it skyrockets in their mind. And the proof is in the pudding. If these are numbers that are happening, that blacks and Indigenous people are being shot and killed by police at such disproportionate rates, we know there's a huge problem. If the reason, like Mr. Levi, is because, like everyone else, we get sick, we have health problems, we can suffer from mental illness, we can suffer from substance use disorders, like anyone else, society, if they're dealing with a white person, the police will be a lot more understanding with that person, a lot more accommodating, try to resolve a situation. But they see a black guy or an Indigenous person, and the first thing they see is threat, we need to protect ourselves, and they shoot and kill them. So the defund the police argument is that's the wrong way to approach it. Is there a way that we can have trained healthcare professionals intervene, respond to wellness checks, respond to situations like Mr. Levi without escalating into people being shot and killed? And like I said, in the healthcare sector, we would never think, no matter how sick someone is, no matter how violent they are, no matter how dangerous they are, we would never think that the solution is to shoot and kill them on a street corner. Mm-hmm. We would do everything in our power but that.
So in the health sector, who are you guys there to save?
Exactly. We're there to protect people. We're there to try to provide excellent care, exceptional care to people. And it doesn't include shooting and killing them because we think we're at risk. Whereas with the police, that's what happened with Mr. Levi. So, Matthew, before we wrap up, there's another issue that's just hot off the presses in New Brunswick. And I think, quite frankly, this is just outraging all of us. And this is an edict that's come from government to civil servants that when they're doing public presentations, they can no longer start with an acknowledgement about land titles here in New Brunswick. So give us an example of what one of these.
So I'm going to read this land acknowledgement because I want to ensure that I read it properly as it's to be said properly. I acknowledge that the lands on which New Brunswick is situated are the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Wistaqua, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy.
All right, so let me get this straight. Our government are saying civil servants can't start off with that. First thing I want to say to the government, is that statement true or false? It is a true statement. How can our government tell people you're not allowed to make true statements? What are they trying to get at? What are they trying to accomplish? This is a true statement. So let me explain this. Unceded means they didn't give it up. They didn't give it away. They didn't say it's yours and we have no claim to it ever again. That's not what they said. At most is you're living and working on it. And this means that our government, yes, our government are not the ones who stole land from Indigenous people, but they were given power. They were made government. They got their offices from people who stole the land. So our government right now are governing stolen land. That's just a fact. And they don't want to acknowledge that they're governing stolen land because they say foolish things like, well, we didn't do it. Well, we didn't do it. Well, you inherited stolen land from people who stole it. So no matter how far back that chain is, it's still stolen land. And it's absolutely embarrassing. I can't condemn this in strong enough terms, that our government are prohibiting people from acknowledging this. And the reason I want to say that is embarrassing and unforgivable of our government to do this is because the statement is true. And they are telling people you are not allowed to make true statements because we are trying to fight something in court. So I think we're going to have to discuss this in more detail in another episode, Matthew, but it's absolutely outrageous that our government are so petty that they've gotten to the point where they're prohibiting people from making true statements. If it was false, if it wasn't accurate, fine. But it's a true statement that they're prohibiting people from saying. And I would say that's absolutely unethical. So Matthew, I'm thinking that it's time to wrap up tonight. So what are your concluding thoughts?
I think when we're looking at the situation with the murder of Rodney Levi, we need to look at the fact of who are the police there to save. As we've kind of discussed today in our medical field, our medical professionals are there to save the individual coming in. But in this situation with Rodney Levi, the police weren't there to save anyone but themselves.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Matthew. I think if we look at that situation, it's egregious. He didn't have to die that day. And the worst thing he did was exhibit symptoms of an illness that he was struggling with, and he actually asked for help. I think that the Defund the Police movement makes a lot of sense. It's always hard to ask for more resources, but it is logical to say within existing resources, can we distribute them in a way that makes a lot more sense? And finally, some of the statistics we've given, like the percentage of Black and Indigenous people that are shot and killed by police, how they're overrepresented in the federal penitentiary system, the facts speak for themselves. There are problems, there are systemic problems in our society, and we need to start addressing them. And then my final note is I'm absolutely ashamed of the government's behavior on this land acknowledgement issue.
And with the land acknowledgement issues, we definitely will go further detail into that in our next episode. But with that, folks, we'd like to thank you for tuning in to another episode of NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. If you want to send us an email for other topics or just to let us know what you're thinking, you can do so by emailing us at nbwa@chco.tv. My name's Matthew Martin, and remember, Black Lives Matter. Thank you.